Hi everyone, this video is going to show you how to make a really basic Pico De Gallo, but we're not going to cover amounts or anything like that. For that, we're going to leave that up to the experts. The main focus in this video is going to be how to do some basic knife skills and some knife safety things as well, and some basic tips for using the knife and the cutting board and those types of things. So the first thing you're going to want to do with anything that you are cutting up in terms of fruits and vegetables is washing all of your produce. Produce grows in the ground, it grows outside, so it might have bugs, it might have pesticides, any number of things, so you always want to wash that off to begin with. Then you're going to cut out an X on the bottom of each of these and cut the core out of the tomatoes, and that's going to get that woody part out of it that you don't want to eat anyway. This X is going to release the skin a little bit more easily when we do our next step. You also are going to want to get a bowl of ice water ready to go, and we're going to use that as a shock after we boil our tomatoes in our next step to stop the cooking process. But you want to have that ready to go, because then you are going to place the tomatoes in a few at a time into boiling water for 30 seconds. And you don't want to leave them in there longer than 30 seconds because we are not cooking the tomatoes. All we're doing is getting them into this water to get the skin just heated up, because this is going to loosen the pectins just under the skin and allow the skin to just peel off. And that is going to also prevent a lot of waste in the tomatoes so that we're not taking off more of the skin than we want, and allow that process to be a lot quicker as well. The entire process of peeling, seeding, and chopping the tomatoes with this is called concasse. It's a French term meaning to chop or to crush, and it's a pretty common process within the culinary world. You can also do this process with peaches. If you want to see how to do that, check out our how to cut fruit video. But this process makes peeling tomatoes a whole lot easier and simpler. But we do want to stop that cooking process, so we're going to throw those into cold ice water really quickly, roll them around a little bit. I keep the strainer in there just so that you don't have to worry too much about putting your fingers into ice water, and that's going to stop the cooking process so that we are not cooking our tomatoes, because this is a Pico de Gallo and we don't want cooked tomatoes. You're going to continue this process until all of your tomatoes have been placed in that boiling water and then in the ice bath to get all of those peelings starting to come off. After that, the peelings come off very, very easily. You can actually see it on some of the tomatoes on the cutting board, but you just kind of slide your paring knife underneath, but they just pop off very easily during this process. And as you can see, the peelings that come off is very little waste, whereas if you were to peel those off with a paring knife, it would be a lot more peeling. So then you're going to take your tomatoes and cut them in half. And if you're preparing this for others, especially if it's in like a public setting, you might want to use gloves for this, because this is a ready-to-eat food. So just keep that in mind. And then you're going to cut it into quarters, and so that's going to make a fourth. And then you're going to scrape out those seeds into a bowl on the side. And this is a part of that concasse process, because the seeds and the juice is going to make the Pico de Gallo too runny and make it not stay on the chip very easily. So after that, you're going to cut those 1/4 pieces into strips, and this is to start your chopping process. And you want to keep your fingers out of the way, take your time. Tomatoes are very, very slimy, so you don't want to get those cut up. As you can see, this is a side view of that, and so you want to be very, very careful to keep your fingers out of the way. Notice that I'm tucking them and just kind of wrapping them around the knife, but just taking my time with this process. It is so easy for your knife to slide. Then you're going to turn it 90 degrees and chop that into cubes. With your knife, you always want to have it working in two directions at once, so down and forward or down and back at the same time. And just be very slow and deliberate with this process. And here is the side view of that, so that you can see what that looks like. I have actually slowed this down so that you can see what this looks like, but that's kind of the process as you're looking. Notice the knife is going down and forward at the same time, and that's what you're looking for in any cutting process. And you're just going to continue that process until all of your tomatoes are cut. You also want to use a bench scraper to remove your tomatoes off the cutting board, not the side of your knife. You'll see chefs using a knife a lot of times, but it's just a lot easier to use the bench scraper, because that way you're not going to cut the side of your hand. So then you're just going to keep on going until all your tomatoes are cut into even sizes. That yellow tomato just makes it look a lot prettier, and so I like to include a little heirloom tomato in there as well. So to make this into a salsa, it's not too difficult of a process. You cut your dice a little bit smaller, which is just making narrower cuts, and then you take a portion of it and you're going to puree it in a blender, or you can just use an immersion blender to make it into a runnier type of sauce. So you can add onions in the preferred amount, and to cut an onion, you're going to begin by cutting the root end off and the stem end, and you don't want to cut very much off of this root end especially. And then you're going to cut the onion in half through the root and keep your fingers out of the way to make sure that you're not cutting those. And that is going to, by cutting through the root, you're going to keep the onion together while you're chopping, and that's really important so that everything's not running all over the cutting board. Then you just peel off that outer brown layer from the onion off of both halves with your fingers, and that should come off pretty easily. It's a lot easier to peel this off after you've cut your onion in half. Then you are going to cut horizontal slices in the onion. And if you don't want your cutting board to slide, you can just put a damp cloth underneath it and your cutting board will not slide as much. But you're just going to cut horizontal slices by taking your knife and just very gently sliding it through. And your knife being sharp is actually going to make it a little bit easier to do this. But don't cut through that root end, because that is going to make your onion fall apart as you're dicing. And you just want to cut through very easily. And then you're going to cut vertical slices straight down, and also not cutting through that root end. And then you just turn it 90 degrees and chop it, and then you end up with a dice that is a nice size. And that's going to be with the root end away from the knife. And the height and width of all the cuts is going to determine the final size of the dice. So the closer together the cuts, the smaller the cut. After that, you're going to wash some cilantro and remove a handful of leaves, and then you're just going to run your knife through those, cutting down and forward at the same time. Cilantro tastes like soap to some people, so you may want to leave that out if somebody in your family has that particular taste issue. But by using a really sharp knife, that means that you're going to bruise the cilantro less, and that cilantro is going to last longer in your Pico De Gallo. After adding your cilantro, you're going to add lime juice and a little salt and pepper to your pico, and this is going to be to taste. You want to taste throughout this process and make sure that it tastes good. You want to use fresh lime if you have it, and then mix it thoroughly. And I always end up taking a little bit out before I add the jalapenos, just because some people like things a little less spicy, and so that way I have some for people that don't like it hot. Before you cut your jalapenos have something in it called capsaicin, and capsaicin will stick to your hands very, very easily. So wear gloves to keep that from happening, and if you don't wear gloves, you're going to rinse your hands when you're done in a 5-to-1 solution to bleach and water, and that will keep the capsaicin from sticking to your hands. So you're going to cut your jalapeno, cut the end off your jalapeno and split it down the middle. And then that white rib in the middle is where the hottest part of it is. So if you want a hotter pico, you can leave that in and leave the seeds in. If you want it milder, take that out before you cut up your jalapeno. I am going to take it out because we don't like ours quite as spicy, and jalapenos are going to vary a lot on how spicy they are based on where they're grown. So then you're going to slice it into thin strips and then turn it 90 degrees and chop it into cubes. I use the paring knife to cut the strips and then the chef knife to cut the cubes. Then you're going to add your jalapenos in and then stir it up and then serve that with chips. If this sits for a little longer, like overnight, those flavors are going to marry together and it's going to be a little bit better, but it's just fine to serve it immediately. But this ends up being really fresh. It tastes really amazing, and the fresher your ingredients and the more locally grown they are, the better it ends up tasting. So this is a great way to use some of those spring vegetables, and let us know in the comments if you try it. Thank you so much for joining us on Mixing with Merks, and please help us out by subscribing. We are super close to monetizing.